Ascultați Books Are Magic, powered by editura Nemira, un podcast despre cărțile, poveștile și oamenii care schimbă lumea. Numele meu e Filip Standavid. 100 de femei afurisite e o carte din imprintul de nonficțiune Orion de la editura Nemira. E o istorie alternativă a unor vieți care au scăpat cumva de destinul unor note de subsol ale așa-zisei istorii mari. 100 de femei, adică în stare să se confrunte cu societatea întreagă pentru pasiunile lor, cu regimuri opresive și acolo unde a fost cazul cu dictatori în toată regula. Invitata noastră e autoarea acestei cărți, Hannah Jewell. Vom discuta în englezește, varianta în limba română va fi redată în întregime pe blogul editurii Nemira. Hi Hannah, welcome.
Hi, wouldn't it be great if I just revealed myself to be fluent in Romanian right now?
That would be absolutely massive. How did this...
Someday, give me 5 years.
How did this book come about? I'm guessing you didn't just wake up one morning and said, right, I need a feminist manifesto and I need to write it right now.
Let's see. I suppose it came out of an article that I wrote for BuzzFeed, the sort of no longer as popular American website that I used to write for, where I wrote a list of women, unknown women of history, much like I do in this book, and it was written with many jokes and swear words, and I just thought this will be interesting. And it was sort of inspired by, at Christmas, my dad had given me a little deck of cards with little unknown women of history on each card, and it's such a gift that like a dad gives to his daughter and he doesn't know what to get her at Christmas, and so he was like, oh, Hannah's a girl, she'll like this is a feminist thing. And I was looking through some of those and I'm sort of thinking about this, and I wrote this first article for BuzzFeed, and it got millions of views and a big reaction. And in the comments section, there were people saying, oh, like, you have to look at this woman. I study this woman from my country, from this country. And so then I did another one with some of the women I'd learned about from that. And then when I was eventually contacted by my book agent, he asked me if I had book ideas. And I said, yes, of course. And I didn't. And I thinking he would, meet me in like 2 weeks' time. And he's like, great, meet me tomorrow in London to talk about this. So I was thinking, well, that was something that I could do. I was thinking what a big hunger there was for learning these stories of these incredible women of history in a tone that wasn't too sort of boring and moralizing, I guess. And so I told him that idea. I could do a book length version with unknown women of history, nasty women of history. We had just had that moment in the 2016 presidential election when Donald Trump called Hillary Clinton a nasty woman. So that was on my mind. And he just said, yep, let's do that. And then I just did it, and was so happy to have that idea that came about through a series of coincidences.
I was getting to try somebody to read this book, and I just mentioned you need to go to the table of contents, see how many of these names ring familiar, because maybe they should be ringing familiar to more people. And I'm afraid I may have answered my own question here, but when you pick names like Ulaya bint al-Mahdi or Walada bint al-Mustafki, that's sort of enticing, but can it be off-putting maybe?
To have names that you don't know? I mean, so with Ulaya, this poet, I found her at an exhibition in London with Arabic language poets, and I studied Arabic in university. And so with her and these other names from all over the world, foreign names people have never heard of, my goal was to not just do another book that tells Americans and British people, and now Romanians, just the same white European historical figures that people know about. And I think when we think of women's history, everyone had, in the US, you learn about the suffrage movement, and you learn about Susan B. Anthony. In the UK, there's similar figures that you always hear about. And while many of those women are great, obviously, and very impressive, my point with this book and finding women from all over the world was to show with this body of evidence that you can go to any time period, any continent, and you can find incredibly brilliant, daring women from any period. So I think that certainly when I started researching, I didn't know who most of these women were. And I found these women by asking friends from different countries, many historians who study different periods, to ask, who is a woman that you wish more people knew about from that country or that period and that time? And so I don't know. I think that it's, what would be off-putting is when I pick up a book that does women's history, and it's just like, let's read about this, this figure,
particular person,
again,
yeah.
Queen Elizabeth I. Let's read about them again and again. So while there are a few more famous names on my list, I wanted it to be spread out as well as I could across different parts of the world, which is a big challenge, having to rely on mostly English language sources, and sometimes with not a lot of information to start with, and to go from there. So I hope that rather than off-putting, it's sort of intriguing that someone who thinks they know it all can look at this table of contents and realize, I don't know any of these women, because they weren't remembered the way that men of history have been.
I was thinking while reading it, Lucy Worsley, the historian, documentary filmmaker, she keeps repeating there's no such thing as history with a capital H. There's different versions of the same events that may be surprisingly different if you just care to go a bit deeper. I get the feeling you may agree with that. Do you?
Absolutely. I think that right now there is certainly an argument, again, in the US and Britain, I don't know if it's the same elsewhere, about political figures, conservative political figures, who think that history is a agreed upon set of facts that happened the way that we learned when we were 8 years old in school. And that's that. Any attempt to learn more and take a critical look at historical narratives is seen as a threat to a nation's fabric, which
is it a threat, by the way?
Well, that maybe it is, and maybe that's not a bad thing. I mean, we have our founding myths in the US, for instance, this heroic revolution for freedom from Britain, which is funny because I'm both British and American. And sort of grew up with my British parents in American school, hearing about, the evil British, which, like, I hate the British too, so that's fine. But sort of seeing the way that this story is told from one side or another. And I think that my goal and that is why that many conservative, mostly, but not entirely, in fact, many liberal politicians too, are afraid of attempts to continue the work of history, which is continuing to find news sources. Historians don't just read the book that was written in the last decade and repeat it to their students. They go to archives, they find original sources. And while my book was not, original for the most part, for a little bit, I relied on secondary sources and not primary sources, but relying on the work of historians who are learning new things about the stories that we thought we all understood. And so maybe it is a threat to, in Britain, for instance, I have many women who fought against the British Empire around the world. And in Britain, the empire is either not discussed in school, or it is celebrated in school as this glorious British moment of domination. And there's less interest in hearing about things from the side of those that were colonized. So I have a few, queenly figures in what is now India. I have Queen Nanny of the Maroons was a Jamaican woman who successfully led many enslaved Africans on Jamaica to freedom in the mountains, and all the sources that we have about her was as this horrible, violent, fearsome witch, basically. So I wrote that chapter being like, we have to bear in mind that her history is an oral history, but what we have written down is written by, British colonial figures who are terrified of her. So we have to take what we know about her with this grain of salt and sort of celebrate this very unlikely resistance to such a powerful thing and these unlikely victories against the British Empire at the peak of its power.
So it's not necessarily rewriting history, if I'm getting this right, but as you were saying, completing history, if you will, alternating histories.
Yeah. I think it's similar to when people say that, like, people will say here, I believe in science, and that's sort of in reaction to a presidency like Donald Trump and approaches to the pandemic that were not founded in science and the things that Trump said. People would react to that by saying, well, I believe in science. But scientists all argue with each other. And of course, things are more known and true than each other. But as science is a contested, critical discipline, so is history. My friends are professional historians. My husband is a history professor. And if there's anything I know about this discipline, it's that it is always adding to, if not rewriting, maybe correcting untruths of the past, but it's also a process of just of adding new knowledge, new perspective, and finding ways to blow students' minds and correct the things that they thought they understood. And yeah, many people hate thinking about history this way.
There's an old quip, what a scientist says most of the time is, I don't know.
Exactly. Exactly. And anyone in history who, if you have Boris Johnson's government in the UK saying that we can't bring down statues of figures of empire, and there's a lot of policing of university history professors in the UK trying to avoid the idea of what they call so-called rewriting history, which is just historians doing their job, and there's so much certainty about creating these narratives of who are the good guys and the bad guys, which is not a great way to think about history anyway, but it's a very contested field. So my book was trying to poke that bear a little.
Back to the book, by the way, researching it must have been quite the headache. You crisscross continents, you get way back to many historical ages, and it all happens at breakneck speed. I mean, you could read this book in one sitting if you put your mind to it. So how hard was it to put it all together? How long did it take?
It was sort of horrible at times to research for a few reasons. That for instance, there's two Native American women in this book, and making sure that I got the language right, the cultural context right, especially because I haven't heard of so many of these women before. Looking at more East Asian women too, I don't know a lot about that region. Places wherever I went that I felt less comfortable about already knowing about that country, having to, before I even learn about each woman, having to figure out what was and wasn't considered unusual at that time and place. And I relied a lot, again, on my friendship networks of historians to send them examples of my writing about for again, some of the like Indian warrior queens, and say like, does this read weird to someone who is an expert in this? I shared my snippets with, like, I have an amazing, one of my favorite one in the book, Funmilayo Ransom Kuti, a Nigerian woman who was involved in Nigerian independence and all sorts of feminist activism in Nigeria. And that I just showed it to my Nigerian friend and was like, am I using the word for town wrong? Am I using this? And so I did that. I benefited a lot from those who helped me with the context of each of these stories. And also because I write this in not a very formal way, there are times where I can just say, we don't know, like we only have this one scrap of evidence about this woman's life. And I included some of these women anyway, even when we can't know a lot, with the hope that this creates a table of contents that someone else who can look into and can continue and to make these names more known, and that other people might research in a more thorough way. But my research was done miserably on the internet and in the British Library, this huge copyright library in London, just suffering over details, but benefiting a lot from that network of friends. And it took me, I had quite a tight deadline from the time that I sold this book to my publisher to turning it in. So it was really only a few months that I had to just all day, morning till midnight, reading biographies, formulating these things, and trying to keep the writing fun in the meantime. So I have no idea how.
So you've basically done nothing else during those months.
I was in between two jobs at the time. So I had just left BuzzFeed and was about to start at the Washington Post. So I had this one summer, no time off. It was all I did, and I lost my mind a little.
And then there's classifying these women. If we may just quickly run through some of the chapters, those with impressive kill counts, the women who wrote dangerous things, those who fought empires and racists, the women who knew how to have a good ass time, and the women who punched Nazis, metaphorically, but also not. That's about the half of the categories. How did you land on those?
So I didn't plan at first to categorize them in this way. I was working through this list of women, adding to women, subtracting them as I was working, adding and subtracting to my master list. And then I think I was on a plane or something thinking, how do I put them in chronological order? That didn't seem to make sense. Do I put them, alphabetically, like it's a reference book? And I thought, no. And then I just thought, like, I've been drawn to certain types of women that, while I tried to cover many disciplines, I ended up with many revolutionaries and as, again, anti-empire revolutionaries, many writers. I feel like writers love writing about writers, so I fell victim to that a little. Very interested always in women who were part of the resistance to fascism in the 30s and 40s in Europe. I can never read enough books about those figures. And I was particularly in those women who punched Nazis section. I chose women who didn't have to be resistance fighters. I chose women who could have just blended into society. Sophie Scholl, for instance, a German, very young university student woman who along with her brothers and friends, led this very doomed resistance within Germany. And she was not Jewish. She could have sat back. So I was very drawn to those tales that were so extremely unlikely and courageous, that I knew I had a lot of those figures. So I was like, well, these are women who punched Nazis, either literally like SOE spies from Britain who killed people, or who didn't, who resisted in other ways. And then the women
just by basic human decency at times,
by doing small actions, which, while that seeming like just small basic acts of human dignity, ended up getting most of them killed too. So these, and I think writing this in 2017 at the beginning of Trump's presidency, having a lot of anxiety about where the United States was going in the wake of Brexit, in this moment, I was interested in who takes a stand and who doesn't and why. So that produced that. And other chapters, like the women with impressive kill counts is early on, is just sort of looking at these primarily more ancient women who were very bloody, vicious warriors, and thinking that this is just counteracts what we think we know about an innate womanhood. It just learning these stories makes us, first of all, very grateful to not live in like 600 AD, but also to understand that those who were making history at a time, at a terrible ancient time, were women as well as men. And those were sort of funny because they defy stereotypes. They were funny ones to write about these, like, often, as I say, quite horrible queens and warriors.
We're so gonna get to the Empress Wu later in the podcast.
Oh, love
we
her.
have to.
Terrified of her too.
For the time being, who did not make the cut and should have?
Oh, and should have. There were a few people who, because I only had women who, some more recent, but only had women who had died by the time of writing the book. And there were a few women in more recent times, perhaps, that I could have included. I was, again, speaking to the same Nigerian friend who helped me on a Nigerian chapter, was telling me about a woman who I hadn't heard of until after I'd finished this book, who worked in public health in Nigeria and who sort of single-handedly prevented an Ebola pandemic, or epidemic rather, in Lagos in Nigeria, through her insisting on keeping someone who she knew had Ebola away from everyone else, isolating them, and then she herself got infected and died. But because of her actions against those who wanted to sort of be in denial about this, she prevented what would have been a really horrible pandemic. So there's figures like that who have only died more recently. And it said, and again, I feel bad, I can't remember her name. And the point of the book is to try and put those names in people's heads and on their tongues. And there were, I think in retrospect, I don't know, there's always, as soon as I finish it, I hear from more people with more women that they had heard of. Should have included a Romanian woman, obviously. So that's my great regret.
Ascultați podcastul Books are Magic, 100 de femei afurisite, o istorie de Hannah Jewell, apare în imprintul de nonficțiune Orion și e disponibilă pe nemira.ro. Descoperiți 100 de povești puțin spre deloc cunoscute ale unor femei care de-a lungul secolelor și pe tot cuprinsul lumii au sfidat convențiile, dictatorii, uneori imperii întregi, și au schimbat istoria. Let's talk for a bit about two of these women in the book. Miriam Makeba is a star in some circles, an absolute diva, by the way, not really known in others. What's the one thing you reckon that people should know about her?
Well, what was so interesting about learning more about Miriam Makeba, who I initially knew about, and she's one of the more famous names, perhaps,
Indeed.
As a singer, as an artist and as a singer. And I think and often the women that we do know from moments in history are famous for being singers or being musicians, artists in other ways. And I think what people may not know about her is her politics and her involvement in radical Black liberation and leftism that and the Black Panthers and we see these figures often who are, oh, she made a difference because she was a famous singer. No, she did because she was
not really.
This like she was a radical political figure, and I think that's what I hope people take away from many of those. And indeed, in the section, Women Who Knew How to Have a Good Ass Time includes many performers who were also incredibly subversive to their time. Gladys Bentley was a drag singer in the Harlem Renaissance who was constantly in trouble with, the morality police in America, in New York City at the time, for challenging gender, what is acceptable for gender, for her dirty jokes, and pushing the boundaries of free speech and gender expectations. Josephine Baker, famous for being an entertainer in Paris, an American who moved to Paris and was a mixed race woman who famous for like doing silly dances around Europe, but also was involved in the French resistance in World War II, also worked in the civil rights movement in the United States, was also a very interesting political figure. And Miriam Makeba, probably more than anyone else, sums that up.
To me, it's telling that no matter where Miriam goes, she somehow manages to get herself into trouble. She gets exiled from South Africa, then she reaches New York, marries a Black Panther, as you were saying, loses her US visa, and still does not stop until the day she dies in 2008.
Absolutely.
That's quite a woman.
Yeah, there's no, and I think that's what's so great about that too, is seeing how she carries on through old age. And while we associate sometimes revolutionary politics with youth, she stayed true to that through her entire life with great personal sacrifice.
It's very Nina Simone-ish, but much less known, I feel.
I think so, especially I think in the United States, probably she's less known.
And then there's Empress Wu of China, the only female leader of that country so far, at least, who reigned in her own name. We got an impressive body count by all standards, scheming and plotting on an imperial scale, a dead baby used for political purposes, and lots and lots and lots of kinky sex. All I can say is, how is this not a Netflix series?
I know. Well, there's something that I learned while researching is there is a Chinese series about Hillary Clinton called Empress Wu in the White House, which is so not flattering for Hillary Clinton, but perhaps accurate in some ways, right? This is so she is this known, as far as I can tell, someone who is, known about in pop culture in China. But I agree, like for so many of these women, I think that people learn about these missing figures of the past through a Netflix series that's like 12 parts long. She had this like horrible, scheming, terrifying political machinations, and as you say, killed many in her path to sovereign power. Because while we know about many queens who are married to kings, who are married to the sovereign, and also many regents, those who are ruling because their underage son, who is the sovereign, is not yet of age. So you have throughout history everywhere women who are technically running countries, kingdoms, empires. But Empress Wu was someone who was herself the sovereign of China at that time. And what was there's such a great full-length biography of her that you can find in my bibliography that goes into her very ruthless quest for power. And I think, again, she is just, her story defies what we think we know about women in history as only appearing as very noble and righteous and downtrodden. She is none of those things. So I really enjoyed
the complete opposite of that, if you come to think of it. But basically, a woman of her time is China, 7th century AD. You have to go badass or you have to go home.
Yeah. And it changes what we think. Often what this book I hope to do was challenge the assumption that it is easy to make even today, that women are innately one way or another, biologically, because of their biology, are weak, or this or that. And again, Empress Wu is none of those things.
Well, humor and then quite a bit of swearing are essential in this book, I would say, both underpinned by political satire. Did you set out to write a polemical book, or did it just turn out like this?
I think I wanted to write a secretly polemical book, maybe less secret if we're talking about it.
Looks quite obvious to me.
Yeah, well, it is obvious, right? But I think that if you see the sections in bookshops that have feminist history or women's history books, they're often very apolitical. You will see there was a very famous children's book in the US, and I think in the UK too, that was a kid's book, a bedtime stories with stories of like mine, more unknown women of history from all over the world. And that book included figures like Margaret Thatcher, the former British Prime Minister, as held up as sort of a like, isn't that great that a woman was a prime minister? Girl power, that is sort of presented in that way. Whereas my approach was to not include Thatcher or figures from more recent history like her, because I'm more interested in women who, you know, with the exception of Empress Wu and the more ancient women who were advancing the struggle for women's rights. And Margaret Thatcher was not necessarily that, other than symbolically being a leader. For the same reason, in the more recent figures were chosen. I have many labor activists. I was, at the time I was writing it, I was failing to organize a union at my job at BuzzFeed. So I was very interested in
there, done that.
Yeah, we've all been there. I was very interested in learning about the women labor activists, and that labor has been a place where many women leaders have arisen. And so, yeah, I wanted to not have it be apolitical, but having it be, it's hard to say because I think everything is political, but I think that the idea was to certainly challenge what we think we know about women from a certain perspective, and to maybe be angering, and to be very angry also. And because it was at times enraging writing this book, researching this book, being mad that I didn't know about incredible women like this before, and that people don't, and that they were often literally killed for what they were doing, even if it was writing letters, you know, just wearing trousers, like stupid things that got these women killed. So that rage, I think, does end up in the writing.
Apart from bringing unknown or lesser known figures to the fore, what would you like this book to be remembered for?
For being a bestseller, for being no, sorry.
Yeah, why not?
I would like it to be the place that a source for people who want to learn more about the women. I think I want there to be someone who does a PhD about one of the women in this book who has maybe less sourcing, less known about her. I want it to be a starting point for more people in future to advance our knowledge about these women and women like them, and to be a weapon in any argument that, for instance, if there's a teen girl at a party and there's some obnoxious boy there saying that women have never done this or that, or women are not as good at math or science or writing or whatever it is, I want that girl to read this book and to be able to say, well, what about this person? What about this person? And to have that add to a body of evidence of excellent women.
It sounds like you're planning on a whole series of books here.
I mean, I can see doing another one at a certain point. As I said, as soon as I write something like this, I learn about more women in more places who would be great additions. So maybe there will be a part 2 someday.
Finally, who would make your top 3 of contemporary nasty women?
Ooh, living ones. Oh, that's so hard. My mother is pretty like this. Oh, I'm not sure. This is putting me on the spot. I think there are many young climate activists, I think, who really embody this. I feel like Greta Thunberg is maybe too well known, but I've met, in the American context, okay, I'll say the students who are leading anti-gun violence protests in the US, the Parkland students and their allies. like that. Climate activists. I'm not giving you specific people. I'm giving you categories. Those who are fighting against climate change, against school shootings in the United States. And I suppose I think that there's some new members of Congress who could categorize this, perhaps, who would fit this mold. But I don't know. I think just today's teenagers, I think, will have an innate fearlessness about them that could lead them to, hopefully, halt the rising seas.
Are you thinking AOC, or am I just conjecturing here?
The reason I don't want to say her, though, is that, and the reason that I didn't put anyone who is still alive in my book is we don't know how she'll end up. She could be, she could have her little centrist turn. She could have I think any politician is vulnerable to corruption and selling out. And I don't, I'm not a fangirl of any politician, but when it comes to her outsized impact, she's certainly making a stir in the United States Congress.
Well, that's about it. Hannah Jewell, thank you.
Thanks so much for talking to me, and I hope people enjoy the book and the translation.
Thank you.
Ați ascultat Books Are Magic, powered by editura Nemira. Sunt Filip Standavid, toate cele bune!